So, good evening, everyone. We have met tonight for Peter and John to talk about the book, which some of you already have, since it's in circulation generally informally, but they're going to introduce it a little more this evening. They will talk to one another around the basis of some PowerPoint pictures, introducing some themes that are in the book. And during that time, you're very welcome to put comments or questions in the chat. And at the end of their talking time, we will try to ask them some of these questions and get some answers. So we look forward to Peter and John talking with us now. Go ahead, folks.
Well, here we are. Are we going to be highlighted now, or we are? Right.
We are.
Oh, we are. Hello, Peter.
Hello, John.
That's good. Nice to be
Right,
here.
what are we going to talk about? We've got to start with, haven't we?
I think, to be honest, as the person who didn't write this book and who's just enjoying it and so on, I'd like to start with the front cover, if that's all right with you. Because that's a real, this is a picture of Holy Island Church, obviously. I say obviously, I presume it is obviously, but it certainly is that anyway. This is the east end of the nave in St Mary's at Holy Island, and it's a fantastic photograph. First of all, I've tried to photograph that, and my pictures come out 90 times worse than that, as it happens. So, why? How did you do it? First of all,
would you like the picture on the PowerPoint?
I'll hold it up.
Yeah, good enough.
All right. Oh, I've got it. Yes, we could.
Can you do it?
Yeah. How did you do the picture?
Using very oblique lighting. We had Richard Carlton was standing over the chancel arch and shining a bright LED torch up at the wall very obliquely. And then I photoshopped him out. You can see the black area behind the title.
Oh, very, very clever.
The key to photographing is low angle lighting.
Beautiful.
We just tried to, this is a really important wall. And English Heritage had loaned us a laser scanner, which whistled and did all sorts of things, cost tens of thousands of pounds. And the end result was a really dark, useless image. I used a £100 digital camera on a tripod and got this. So I was rather pleased with it. But you need to see things well before you can interpret them.
Yeah.
But it's a great wall. I've got history with that wall because I visited Holy Island in about the late 70s, and I think this wall had just been exposed by the moving plaster. And I saw that earlier chancel arch, and I sent a photograph of it to current archaeology. I don't think it had been something was known to the archaeological world before.
It's
and then later on,
it's clearly a very complicated wall, isn't it? It's are we confident about what it is, and you're going to give us on
the next slide? You'll see I've phased it.
I don't think we're going to see the next slides because
you'll see I've sort of divided the masonry up and put different letters on to show what I think is the phasing, because I think there's about 6 phases of different dates of masonry in there.
Right.
So can we get the next frame? There, the next one. Yes, there we are. There's a massive stonework. A is, I suspect, the early monastery before the Vikings. Then there's B is clearly later masonry. C is the early chancel arch that has been cut into by D, the around 1200 chancel arch. Then there's a heightening E, another heightening F, and that has the high level doorway, still Saxon in style, G in it. Then at H as the mark of an old low pitched roof, a gable I above, and finally J, which may be Victorian, which goes with the present roof. And on the right there, you can see two pictures of carved stones we only spotted once we got that photograph by sort of enlarging sections of it.
The thing about
It was
this,
gloriously
Peter, sorry, if I could just come in here. The thing about this picture is that if they hadn't stripped the wall down, you'd never have known, would you? I mean, there's nothing.
No, you were,
I mean, I think my own feeling is that there are probably some coins stick out at the on the outside of at this
yes,
east end of the nave. And you might have had some clues that there was an Anglo-Saxon, because that does look Anglo-Saxon.
Yes, you can see coins there. That had been spotted.
Mm-hmm. And what other things convince you that this is? What other thing has convinced you that this is a Saxon wall, then, Peter?
Well, the style of the stripworks around to see the early chancel arch is great long curving blocks, which isn't the normal way to do things. The Normans usually use regular voussoirs. And then the high level opening G has alternating big upright blocks and smaller horizontal blocks in its jambs, what they term escum fashion. That's again a Saxon feature.
Is it fair to say that you don't get these high level openings at any other time? I'm just trying to think if there is any, if they disappear entirely at the end of the Anglo-Saxon period.
Well, occasionally you get one from a tower into a very western gallery later medieval, but this one's over the chancel arch.
Right.
And we do know that Saxon, especially Saxon monastic churches, often have high level floors in them. It could be a monk's dormitory up there or something. Deerhurst, the famous Saxon church in, I think it's Worcestershire, had 3 levels in the nave. So these are quite different to medieval churches.
What do you think they used them for? Have you any idea what they used them for? Why they were there?
It could be a dormitory for the monks up there.
Right.
High level chamber that was secure where to get treasures. I don't know.
Good, clear place to watch, make sure that everybody was kneeling down properly and had their eyes closed during the prayers. I mean, bit of spot keeping an eye on the congregation. It's fantastic. Does everybody accept you? I mean, you drew this and you designed this. Broke up the way you see it as having been constructed and so on, and we're fairly certain about the fact that that's an Anglo-Saxon bit of chancel arch peeping up above the later one. Does everybody accept that? I seem to recall somebody saying that they thought that earlier bit of chancel arch might be a sort of relieving arch over another. I mean, are you convinced that this is Anglo-Saxon?
There have been several articles in print since I put this in Current Archaeology saying it was probably Anglo-Saxon work, and that was in the English Heritage Guidebook to the Priory until the latest edition about 3 years ago, which said categorically there is nothing pre-Norman in the parish church. And I wrote to English Heritage and I wrote to the person who'd written the guidebook at Leicester University, and nobody would reply or talk to me.
Well,
so I was determined to get it out. I'm fairly sure this is a Saxon building.
I would have to say that I think the man must be a plank. You know, I mean, that is an Anglo-Saxon wall, isn't it? It's been mucked around with and altered and built up, but the features, the existence of that high-level doorway or whatever it is, it
could be in part post-Viking, because we know there was a Christian settlement there after the Viking raids. When the Vikings became Christian, they certainly had some sort of settlement there, because so much sculpture has been found, which is Anglo-Scandinavian. And that's a bit that's been missed out of history, but archaeology tells us about.
Well, that's a good start anyway. That's a really nice. So was Anglo-Saxon stuff one of the highlights of the book as you were of the county as you were looking around? What other things grabbed you in Anglo-Saxon? Oh, hang on. What about these pictures on the right hand side? Because I mean, it's
recycled in that wall, and we only spotted these on the photograph. Such is the quality of the photograph. You can see on both of those carvings and moldings. The bottom one is high up beside to the right of opening G. And these had obviously been recycled from something earlier, and they're probably architectural fragments. So when they were building the wall at that level, there was already an earlier structure they were taking bits from. The problem is putting actual dates to this.
I mean, presumably the evidence, we all know the sort of history of the island, or at least as far as it's accepted, that it was existed for several hundred years and then was abandoned for a while and then resettled and then abandoned again. And so, I mean, there clearly must have been quarries of older stone. Have you got any sense of what those decorative things represent at all?
Possibly things like string courses,
right,
or impost moldings,
right,
from earlier building.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole situation has been further complicated in the last 4 years since the archaeology practice has found the foundations of an early church on the Yuff, on the separate ridge to the south of the church.
Yeah.
I still think this is pre-conquest. I think that one is as well, but I'm not quite sure how they relate, except that Saxon monasteries like to have separate churches.
The thing is that the Norman bits, the Romanesque bits of the current chancel arch, and particularly the round arches on the north side there, with their, I mean, they are so presumably not that much later than the Norman conquest. I mean, they'll be 12th century, I suppose, but they're so fantastically sophisticated as buildings by comparison to what you're seeing on the back wall there.
Yes, well, it's a matter of nice polychrome work where they use sandstone of different colours making blocks. But that is, you know, that's at least a century after the Norman conquest.
Right.
What we used to call transitional style.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice start. So what else did you see in Anglo-Saxon terms, Peter?
Well, move on, we'll see something.
Let's move on. Let's move on.
Next frame.
I'm all agog. Oh, right.
Yes, this is Elston Church near, I live in Northumberland now, and this is Elston Church. And built in the wall, just in the side of the entrance door, is this stone. And it's very, very worn, sort of being chiseled over. It has a carving of a vine scroll design.
It does.
You may see better on the drawing to the right. And that looks to me to be quite early Anglo-Saxon. If you see the detail, how one bit of shoots comes off and then crosses the main stem in the top right, that is exactly parallel on the Rothbury cross, part of which is now the base of the font, which is early 8th century, I think.
The thing about this, I mean, I personally would never have seen this. I mean, I've been shown it by you, and I can see it here, and it looks absolutely clear on the stone itself, and then the way you have the ability to pick it up in the drawings and just without cheating on it to make it clear what you're looking at and so on is absolutely extraordinary. And to me, there's just no doubt about this. Sorry?
Yeah. Low angle lighting, taking photographs with a lamp held obliquely, very close to the face of the stone, is really key to seeing warm sculpture.
I'm glad you've mentioned that, because you do say somewhere in the book that if you're going to start using low angle lighting and doing the side, you ought to warn people in the village that you're turning up. You know, it's they don't want to see you crawling around with your. The thing about this, though, I mean, this is a fantastically characteristic Saxon motif, isn't it? It's there in the Bewcastle cross. It's there in the Rothbury cross, the font, the bit of the font. There, it's and of course it derives from the Eastern Mediterranean, presumably, and it's the existence of it here suggests somebody who was a sophisticated person who knew about international motifs, in a sense, doesn't it? And the thing I love about it, I mean, you already mentioned it, but I love that little quirky tendril that crosses over from the vine into the sort of lobe in the top part of the picture there, because it seems to me that this motif is a very it's a very sort of stylized version of nature, the way they used these vine scrolls and lots of other things in the same sort of way. But that little curving tendril is not stylized at all. It's observed. It's realistic. It's somebody who's playing with the design, and I think that's absolutely beautiful. It's like in Jarrow, for example, there's a picture of a bird, a carving of a bird, and you can tell that it's a blackbird. You know, it's so realistically looked at, and that just shows how sophisticated the Anglo-Saxon people, carvers, could be, really, and how much they knew. Beautiful.
Of course, the church is dedicated to St Cuthbert. And the tradition is that when the monks were carrying Cuthbert's body around Northumberland, after the Vikings drove them off Holy Island, they stayed here. Had it been a monastery at that time, which I suspect it might have been, then of course they would have known where the monasteries were and where they should call in for bed and breakfast.
Right. Well, but there's nothing else in Elston except the name, and that is there from that sort of period. Or
yeah.
Right. Okay.
As yet. Yeah. Okay.
Beautiful. Next one. Show us another picture. Another picture. I love that. Only Peter would have spotted that, I think. Right.
Yes, this is a Stratfordham church.
Ooh.
And the giveaway for Saxon churches is often the angle coins. That's a coin with a Q, which are the great big stones they use in the corners of the nave and chancel. And here we are, looking at the tower, which is 12th century, but in the angle between the tower and the west end of the south aisle, you can just see the massive cornerstones of the nave showing through.
I never spotted this either. I listed this. I was a listed building man who was responsible for Stamfordham, and I never spotted this at all. And in fact, I didn't think of it as possessing anything of an earlier period like that. But its situation, the church's situation, is very characteristically Anglo-Saxon, isn't it? It's on a knoll, a very profound knoll, looking down over what would have been, now it's sort of low-lying fields, but it would have. There's lots of evidence that it was wet and flooded and marshy in the past. I think some of the names contain the word that, well, Fenwick is the village, next village along, which suggests fens and things like that. So it's a very Anglo-Saxon situation. That's a nice one, because nobody would have thought of that.
There is a good Saxon cross from here, which got snaffled by Durham Cathedral in the 19th century.
That's
you have
typical
to go to the Monk's Dormitory collection to see it.
Right. Well, that's fantastic.
Okay.
So these are, I mean, both of those last two pictures are the sort of things, it seems to me, that you've reached the part that other books don't reach, as it were, that people would not have noticed, or which haven't been mentioned. What else have we got in an Anglo-Saxon terms before we move on from this, do you think? What's the next picture we're going to look at?
Next slide. Yeah, this is one of my things. You probably know cross slab grave covers. And here's one that was found, I think, in 1970, and when they were ploughing the field to the east of the parish church at Edlingham. And nobody's really had any idea of its date, but it shows a cross with like cusped arms, like rounded armpits, you can see. And I've come across several other very similar ones on the Scottish side of the border. Although there's one at Hexham Abbey as well, and they're all at very early sites. There's one built into the passage in Jedburgh Abbey, which I've only seen a drawing of because they won't let you climb up to the passage now. Then there's a couple of Oxman, not far from Jedburgh, and there's a whole series at Hodham over near Dumfries, where there was a very early monastery where Saint Mungo, who was also known as Kentigern, lived at one stage. And there's one slab, and people have been uncertain of the date of these things. In fact, one published account says they could be anything between the 7th and the 14th century, which is rather a long time bracket. But recently, they found another slab there, which is drawn there, a second from the right, which has got single line interlace on it.
Yeah.
Now that tallies with stones from both Holy Island and from Whithorn, which are probably the 8th century. So I suspect all these cross slabs are quite early Saxon work.
What is it? I mean,
This
because
hadn't
if
been
I'd seen that myself, you know, having read and looked at stuff that you've written before and knowing what I'm looking for, I would not have guessed that that wasn't a medieval stone. What is it that tells you that it's not, that it's earlier?
Well, it's quite different in feel. It's simple, it's in high relief. It's the form of the cross is the main thing.
Right.
I mean, cross slabs go right through the medieval period, but this is just quite different to the standard 12th, 13th, 14th century slabs we find in large numbers. And
So
we do know Edlingham, there's documentary evidence of it being an early monastic site
Right.
back in the 800s.
Right. Does Edlingham have
So it's an
anything
important
else?
place.
Does Edlingham have anything else that is that supports that?
Well, if we look at the next frame,
Oh, lovely.
the west end of the nave is very strange. It's usually thought to be early Norman work, but I'm not quite sure. There's this lovely tower which is defensible, which brings us our next theme in a moment. But the tower built against it, but the drawing, which is by W.H. Knowles from about 1900, on the left, shows the west end of the nave, sort of looking through the tower. And it's got this very simple, massive doorway, a window above, and then above that, now inside the tower, this high level, so it's an oculus, a circular opening. And again, when I got up there, I used side lighting, again the same theme, oblique lighting, and it's got this strange zigzag pattern all the way around it.
I
That
can't.
could be Norman Chevron work.
Yes, well, it is a bit like that, but it's also I can't think of an example to say it, but it reminds me the circle around the window itself, the oculus window itself, reminds me of the sort of way that Anglo-Saxon artists drew halos. Almost, it's got and not just the shape, the slightly elongated shape, like you still get in sort of Crete and places like that, later drawings, but not just that sort of slightly elongated shape, but also the use of sort of chevron decoration in that sort of way. I think that's distinctly Eastern in its feel, and therefore distinctly perhaps Anglo-Saxon as well. So what do you make of that?
Well,
then?
There's an outer ring of saltire crosses, can you see? On the right of the main circle. They're like X-shaped. Now that's parallel in the west door at Corbridge, which is thought to be 7th, 8th century.
Right.
So yeah, it could be very early.
Right.
So I leave a question mark. This whole west end could be a survival from a very early church. I'm not sure. Most of the church is 12th century. Then that western tower with its very, very thin windows, clearly defensible. I mean, they never knocked an arch through from the nave into the tower. They only left this doorway which could be defended. So the tower was somewhere you could retreat to.
It's a fantastic place. It's just
Edlingham's a wonderful place.
It is a wonderful place. I always I can't resist telling people about my first visit there, which was in winter and there was snow all around. It was very cold. In fact, it was the coldest place in Coldland. It was just unbelievable. And the thought of going to a service there seemed like really intensely challenging. But fortunately, it was all right for the vicar, because the pulpit had been entirely lined with sheepskin all the way around and underneath, so that he was all right. He probably did 3-hour sermons, you know, while. But it's been replaced now, so it was a source of embarrassment. But it's a wonderful place, and I don't think, you know, you do get that sense of the fortified qualities of it, obviously. But I don't think, and maybe the shape of the west end, the east end of the south side there, remind you of the sort of things that you see at Bywell, for example, or as if that could be you don't think that curved top, that bit of wall is a piece of an Anglo-Saxon nave, do you not? Or you do, because of the oculus window?
Well, I don't know. It's one of these things, we have no hard and fast answers. It's often thought to be about, say, circa 1100, very early Norman.
Right.
But we know so little about Saxon stone churches.
Right.
And we do know it could well be a high status site, right back around 800. If they built the stone church then, what would it look like? Well, we're not quite sure. So I just like to leave our bets open on this one.
Right.
It just might be much earlier than we think. Right.
It's such a curious place to have built a church as well. It seems to tie in with the idea of monkish desires for asceticism, because there can't have been many comforts round about it, high up on the hills like that and surrounded by. I mean, obviously it became more populous later on, but so that's great. Move on. Yeah. Move on. Oh my goodness! Talking of defensible.
We've seen the tower at Edlingham, but there are quite a few later medieval defensible churches. And here are a couple. Bellingham, a fabulous ribbed vault over the nave, and Elsdon, which you already mentioned, where there are vaults over the two nave aisles. There's no vault, at least no vault now, over the nave or chancel. There might have been once, but there is this, and a vault is the ultimate fireproof roof, isn't it?
Right. Wow. Well, let's take the slightly more conventional one first, which is the Bellingham one with its rows of chamfered ribs there supporting a stone roof, which really does take you back to quite a lot of castle basements and tower basements, doesn't it? It's I'm thinking, for example, of the basement of King James Tower, or the King's Tower at Ford Castle, for example, which is is rather like that. And are there any other ones that you can think of?
There was formerly at Seg Hill Tower that had a ribbed vault in the basement. East Shafto Hall has a ribbed vault in its tower basement.
Yes, it does.
Quite a few bridges have ribs underneath like that.
Well,
Portland Castle, there are small scale vaults.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So I think it's quite neat.
So what can you say about it? I mean, to me, that looks like a pretty sophisticated piece of building. There's a lot of skill involved in building a thing like that.
Yeah.
It's
just. I think it's quite late. We know the Scots raided here, and there's a lot of fighting centered on the church in the 1580s. And in 1609, the church was lying in ruins. So I suspect this vault is actually, 1610 or 1620. So it's really post-medieval. We forget how late a lot of the troubles went on.
Or the fact that they couldn't ever convince themselves that they wouldn't come back, maybe. Stable doors being what they are, you've got to keep them shut. When you finally get one, maybe it's... Because I don't suppose it was attacked again after 1609, was it? Bellingham, I don't suppose. I don't know.
Well, Philip Dixon's famous saying is, every castle is built too late for the last war.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
Elsdon got burned. It was burned 2 years running in the 1580s, once by the Scots, and then the other by local families, including the Elliots and the Armstrongs. So maybe this refurbishment of the church is of the same sort of date, very late 1500, 1600.
The thing about those aisles in Elsdon Church, they're sort of quadrant aisles, aren't they? They're sort of quarter circles, as it were. And I mean, I can't think of another example anywhere. I mean, there may be ones, but I can't think that I've seen vaulted aisles in some churches in France, for example. Yeah. But I mean, that seems like a completely unique response. Why do you think they've made the aisles so narrow?
Well, the aisles are narrow because they've thickened the walls on the inside. Where that Saxon cross is built in this into the side of the south doorway, you can see a clear joint on either side where they've added about another 50 centimeters internally to the aisle wall, and so the walls would hold the vault up.
Right.
There's a lot of weight up there with all this stone.
Right. Am I right in thinking that there were no windows in the nave at one stage? Do I remember?
Very small one.
I seem to remember Archdeacon Singleton or somebody in the early 19th century saying that the nave was like a sort of stone box almost. Or
Well, there's no windows on the north, and the two windows on the south are both Victorian. There are little windows in the west end of the aisles,
right.
which a Norman worker reused.
They're extraordinary. So
again, it's a church that's had a very complex history.
I mean, just have you anything else to say about defensible churches? Or, I mean, are there any other examples that we're going to come up and look at?
Well, if we go to the next one, we'll see one that, again, this is Corsonside. Beautiful little unimproved church. Do you know it?
Yeah.
And here's some early construction drawings. There's the 12th century church, top left, nave and chancel. Then, guessing by the 16th century, it had been remodeled. I think it had lost its chancel after troubles, remodeled as a defensible building. Then it was restored again in the 1730s, and then the windows were enlarged in the 19th century, as you can see there. So, but actually, since drawing these, I've had another look at the church, and I think it's even more complicated. But the next frame will show the evidence for this.
Just before we, oh, well, that's all right. We can go back, can't we, to those pictures in a moment.
Yeah.
I hate this picture, by the way. I just want to step in, Peter, and say I hate this picture on the left. And the reason I hate this picture on the left is that I also listed this church, and I've always loved it, and I've travelled to it often and been there on many occasions, and have never once spotted the feature that Peter is pointing out to us now. And I'm sure you can all see it. Of course, you can all see the outline of the removed vault in the west end. I just can't believe I've never spotted it.
Were the walls plastered at one stage? I don't know.
I think they might. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. They could have been. They could have been whitewashed. Yeah, I bet that was the case. But the thing is, I mean, if that is the outline of a vault, right?
Yeah.
It's which it clearly is. I mean, I'm not trying to cast any doubt on that. It's either that or a gigantic chancel arch or something at the wrong end. So it's got to be a vault. But the profile of it suggests something immensely heavy and primitive almost in its lowness.
Here there's clear evidence on the outside that as at Elston, they thickened the walls, but here they thickened them on the outside, not the inside.
Can we go back to the?
There's also.
Can we go back to the drawings? The 12th century one, that's fine. That's nice. The 16th century one, you have. What's the evidence for the tower on the at the?
Right, if we go forward a slide again, I'll show you.
Right.
At the western bay of the nave. No, back to the other one. The western bay of the nave is taller than the others, which is very odd. And there's evidence of a high-level opening in the north wall. But if you climb up a ladder and look into the roof space above most of the nave, you can see that the tops of the side walls are level with that ceiling. But in the western bay, they're 1.5 meters taller. Now, on the outside, they're all at the same level, which is very odd. So in this western bay, the walls have been taller, which suggests a narrow tower there to me. And that upper opening suggests there was something there.
Okay.
It's all very conjectural. the other thing is, and if we go on to the next one now, Elaine, plan. Here, when they scythed the grass in the churchyard last summer, something showed through I hadn't seen. There were humps and bumps at both ends of the church, which are drawn on there, which suggested the church had been longer both ways, that maybe there'd been a tower at the west end, and that the chancel had been a bit longer, which is not surprising. So
the drawing
we
again.
need to dig to find out.
Could we just go back to the drawing again, Elaine? Because the next one further back, that one there. I'm enthralled by that thing in there because there are churches that I know. Well, that's one church I know in Cumberland. I'm from Carlisle originally, and Brough by Sands Church has got had originally towers at both ends and has no east window at all. It's still got a strange windowless room beyond the nave, and there is a tower, heavily fortified tower at the east end as well, at the west end as well. And so in that sense, there are existing examples of churches with that particular form. And you could imagine that if it had a multiple use to protect people as well as to worship in, I don't know, extraordinary. It's a fantastic place again. Well, and once again, mind you, it's dedicated to St. Cuthbert, isn't it? It's
another Cuthbert, yes,
It's one of this little group of St. Cuthbert churches.
And there's no clear Saxon evidence except for a very old cross base in the churchyard. It doesn't have any stylistic features, but it's certainly it's very rough, but it's certainly Saxon in feel.
Right. Well, that's fantastic.
And of course, there's a wonderful, very nice modern altar hanging, altar frontal, with a pair of otters on it. And of course, that's the Cuthbert connection, because Cuthbert used to go and stand neck deep praying in icy water in the sea all night. And then it was somebody observed that when he came out of the water, sea otters came and dried him off, rubbed their fur on him.
I'm not sure that's legal nowadays. You can't, you're not allowed to do that anymore. But yeah, well, I've never seen that either. I've never seen the otter carving either. That's remarkable.
It's
so
it's a modern altar frontal. There's a pair of otters on it. Yeah,
okay. So that's two major themes of you know, one of the points that I always make about churches that you go to places for particular things. If you want to see little tiny hill chapels, you can go to the Lake District, or if you want to see vast wool churches, you go to Suffolk or something. But you've identified here two common themes in Northumbrian churches. They're both wide enough to be called common themes.
Widespread, yes. There are lots of themes, but those are two of the ones that stand out as interesting.
Right. And were there many surprises then in that particular, in either of those two themes? Did you find much in Anglo-Saxon terms that you hadn't expected, and much in defensible terms that you hadn't expected?
Well, nothing really more exciting than Holy Island.
No.
That was exciting.
No.
But I mean, they're all interesting. They're all exciting. There is still scope for further finds. When I go back to a building the 10th time, I may well spot something I haven't seen on the previous 9 visits.
Yeah.
You just need to keep going and standing and staring. That's important. Time to stand and stare.
Yes. Right. Move on. What's next?
Lost churches.
Oh.
Just 3 examples of what we have lost in Northumberland.
Well, I know that hilltop on the at Alnmouth, on the south side of the River Aln. Presumably, originally, I think that was only isolated from the rest of the village after 1800. I think when the river changed its course.
This painting is 1796.
Right.
And it's the old church of St. Wallerick, who was actually a Norman saint So although this painting says the old Saxon church, it's more likely it was quite early Norman work.
It looks,
And
I mean, the
again,
windows look 12th century, don't they? The windows all look 12th century there in that drawing.
Yeah.
And
Two levels of windows in the transept. That's interesting. Was there an upper floor? We don't know. I mean, although the hill has been eroded, there are some foundations of this still surviving on the top, and it will be very interesting to have a dig and retrieve what information survives, because there are still some physical remains of the central part of this church.
The windows, or the upstairs windows, are at least of equal size to the downstairs windows, aren't they? I mean, they, you know, and that little glimpse of the window on the west side, presumably east side, the little one in the gable end, anyway, looks like a sort of major window peeping over there, and so it does suggest that there is that maybe the most important room was upstairs, or that it wasn't a church, or that it was part of a monastery, or
unusual church. And we do have 4 or 5 antiquarian drawings of it, showing it in varying stages of ruin, for which we're very grateful. But there is still a chance to retrieve some information from although the physical remains have been much abraded and the hill's been eroded on all sides, there's still a chance to retrieve something here, I think. Watch this space.
Bits of Alnmouth, I'm always struck by, as I walk around Alnmouth, that there are fragments of there are a few houses surviving, a relatively early one with very worn stones. The form of the old post office, for example, I think it's called, right at the sort of end of Main Street, is lovely old stonework, and you know, something like this must all have been used somewhere, and they wouldn't have just allowed it to.
Yeah.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Who's the drawing by?
I don't think it's signed.
It's not signed.
No.
Might say Bateman or something, or Batman.
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
There are a few drawings. Some are in the county history.
Right, that's a good one. What else have we found in? Oh,
and here's another lost one. This is
gracious.
Demolishing All Saints or All Hallows in Newcastle.
Gosh.
Demolished in 1786, but thankfully some drawings of it were made when they were putting it down. And you can see it was an interesting, big, late medieval church, a bit like the other churches in Newcastle. Of course, although it's gone, there's a very fine Georgian structure being raised on its site.
Well, there are a lot of questions this throws up. First of all, it is the question of how it got to be in such a condition to allow it for it to be needed to be demolished. Do we know that? And what had gone wrong? Or
I think a lot of churches fell into a bad state in the 17th and 18th century.
Right.
And maybe it just got too far. Or
it
maybe
was sort of it was a relatively poor part of town. At least it was on the northern edge of a poor part of town with Sandgate and down there. So perhaps, but I mean, this is an instantly recognisable Newcastle church, isn't it? Really, I mean, the arches, for example, on the south side of the tower there are almost identical to the arches in St Nicholas Cathedral there, and if you look at the actual arches of the arcade beyond, again, like the cathedral, or the present cathedral, they have no capitals. They just sink down into the imposts in the same sort of way as the cathedral one does, and the grandeur of it, the size of it, almost matches St Nicholas. That must have been an amazing building. I know there are certain bits of it. Sorry?
Roger Thornton, who was the you know, the mayor, was it Roger?
Yeah.
Whose brass was in here. Who was the
Yes,
mayor?
his brass.
He was a very well, and his coat of arms and things are several times in the cathedral, and they were in this church as well.
Right.
So his money was behind the.
Yeah. But you know, if that.
Of course, he had his marvelous brass, which was moved from here to the cathedral.
Edward Bateson, thank you very much, Christopher. 1895. That's amazing.
It says on the painting 80 something. He may have copied an old. I suspect he copied an older drawing, colored it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the brass is fantastic. It's one of the best I've ever seen anywhere. And so this was clearly a very significant church. But I hadn't realized it. I'd sort of assumed in my mind that it was because it's on a sort of relatively small hilltop or ledge rather on the side of the hill there, yes. The new church, the current church, with which falls away sharply down towards the Eusburn. Yeah. On three sides, it falls away sharply. I'd assumed it was rather a small church, but in fact, that's absolutely fantastic.
I did not know.
Yeah.
I mean, quite likely it sticks, even if the new church is on its site, it wouldn't cover the whole site because the new church is round and this was a long rectangle.
Yeah.
So maybe its foundations, part of it is still there sticking out from under the new church.
Could be there, yeah. Yeah, it could be. But I mean, there's a very old graveyard round about the new church as well with early things that predate I don't know. Very good. All right, so that's a couple of nice ruined ones. Anything else?
Okay, then.
Gosh.
Now this is another loss. The church wasn't entirely lost. This is Rothbury. And in about 1850, the church was 3/4 rebuilt, and the architect was George Pickering. And he destroyed a lot of medieval work, including this very strange western tower. And it's a very mysterious church. We've already mentioned the font which we use as part of an 8th century cross, but it's likely there was a Saxon monastery here. And there are 18th century accounts that are saying the church used to extend much further west, and you could see the foundations of it. Now that tower, the tower is very strange. We have 2 or 3 drawings with it on. And then I recently came across in the Woodhorn archive a plan of the church by Salvin, the architect, who was taken on. He planned a rebuilding, but he wasn't employed, but he made his plans before Pickering got at the building. And Salvin had intended to keep the tower. And on Salvin's plan, he shows the tower, the old tower, in some detail. And it shows that there was a big arch in each of all 4 walls of it, as if maybe it had been the crossing, the central point of a much larger church. Now, there was, interestingly, there was a dowsing survey done, and again, I'm certainly not sure about dowsing, but a dowsing survey in the 1980s showed a western church projecting further beyond here, exactly like the one at Jarrow, almost too like the one at Jarrow, which we know the size of. But then, about 15 years ago, there was a trench put down outside the West End. They were putting in new toilets, I think. And they found evidence. They didn't find any evidence of a Saxon nave. In fact, they found evidence that said there'd never been a Saxon nave. So the dowsing said one thing, the excavation said another.
Right.
But the old plan of the tower goes back to suggesting there was a western structure. So it remains a mystery. And as I often say, we just have to live with the mystery.
The tower has the sort of, in my mind, it has the profile that the tower that I think of is Jarrow, St. Paul's Jarrow.
Yes,
it's the slightly tapering, rather fine, rather delicate shape, smaller than you might have expected, but high.
And that tower was built to link 2 churches,
right.
An eastern and a western church. So that might have been the case here.
Yeah. you could have glazed all of the, on grand designs that have glazed all of those arches and had a nice little corridor between the two churches. And but the church, on a different note, several different notes actually, it's a pity Rothbury doesn't look like that now. I love Rothbury, of course, but that's a fantastic picture, isn't it, of fine thatched cottages, and the church itself is so absurdly picturesque. I mean, the one thing that that most Victorian architects couldn't do is be honourable about picturesque old messes, as it were. They had to tidy them up. Even our great ones like Dobson, particularly Dobson, he was shocking about tidying up things that didn't suit his sense of the respectable. But that's a wonderful
Well, the
building.
Victorians, the later Victorians didn't like galleries, did they? And that church was obviously packed full of galleries. If you look at all those windows in the roof.
Yes. Well, I mean, Dobson was a very much an evangelical as well, and he liked galleries for himself. I mean, when he built the church that he went to was Jesmond Parish Church, and even in the sort of 1870s, 50s rather, they built galleries in. But there, he's wiped them all away, or at least Pickering has wiped them all away. It's all very sad. It's beautiful. I was also, when I look at that, I'm also struck as how quickly the mountains in Coquetdale have eroded in the 100 years since. Yes, they were really fantastic in those days. That's a wonderful picture. She's probably got a few pounds too much on, that lady, as well. But it's so pretty. Yes.
Right, I think we're more or less through. What's the next slide, Elaine?
Yes.
Oh yes, no, just to show what you get in the book. I have to do an advert for the book, really. This is the sort of way I've handled each of the, well, best part of 100 churches in the book. There are about 60 or 70 still in use and 30 in ruins. This is one that's in use. Oh, this is Holystone. And I won't go into the full story, but just showing you the layout, really. There are some photographs of the church. There's descriptive text, which is both a main account, then there's like a summary in brief, taking you through the site, the history, the form, the structural history, lapidary material, carved stones and things, and fittings and furnishings, all very much in précis form. And there you've got a ground plan. In this case, showing what we know of the monastery that went with the church, and an elevation where I've endeavoured to, as with that wall at Holy Island, do some phasing. In this case, the medieval masonry is purple, the 18th century masonry is blue, and the Victorian masonry is yellow. And I like colour coding on plans, as you'll see. But that's the sort of account you get of each church. So
it's a lovely way.
It took me a while to write it.
To me, it's a lovely way to. Sorry, Peter. I was going to say, to me, it's a lovely way to. I can't get. I'm going to shut up. What I wanted to say was, I think it's a lovely way to confront a church or a building of any sort. So you've got all of your faculties are called into use. You've got pictures to draw your attention to particular places or to tickle your fancy, as it were. The drawings accentuate those in a little sort of way, just by, and then the plan, and then I mean, there's such a lot of information there. I think it's absolutely brilliant.
Well, I've been looking at these churches over the last 15 years. The diocese have taken me on to write archaeological assessments of about 50 of them. And then really it was with COVID striking. I thought, I need something to keep me sane. I need something to do. So I did a church a day. In the evening, I'd read up my accounts of the building and look at my pictures. I'd sleep on it. The next day, I would write it up. And the remaining dozen or so churches that I haven't done assessments of, as soon as we were allowed to, I got out and did them. So I finished the project on Northumberland churches, and this is the fruit of it. Although the diocese had to thank for the initial stages. So there are, if you want them, even more long-winded accounts of all the churches, which I think are available online. These are pre-seed forms. So this is Northumberland Churches Light, as it were.
The thing about it that I'm struck by, having what we've looked at today, is that they're an odd lot. We haven't seen anything grand and splendidly architectural. We've seen ones like this, which are small and simple. We've seen Corsonside, we've seen Elsdon, which has been altered on hundreds of different occasions. I mean, how do you feel, having looked at them all? How do you feel about Northumberland as a place to come and look at churches? Would you advise people to do it?
Well, yes, it's great, because the churches are Northumberland. Old churches reflect the landscape, they reflect the history of the place. And none better than mine, for instance, the Wool churches of Norfolk and Suffolk reflect the particular history of that area. But the Northumberland churches reflect certainly the troubled medieval history of the border county. And they reflect the changing fortunes of the people, they reflect the geology, they reflect the geography. But they are Northumberland. They are, if you like, vernacular buildings, most of them. Some are quite polite, places like Alnwick, where under the umbrella of an adjacent castle, they've built quite a posh perpendicular church, which would be recognisable as such anywhere in the country. But places like Elsdon and Corsonside and Kirk Newton are pure Northumberland. You couldn't get them anywhere else.
It's difficult to think of any beyond, say, Brinkburn or Tynemouth, or which have that full-scale North Yorkshire perfection about them. Even churches, even really grand churches like Bamborough and Norham and so on, are a blend of very local sort of qualities and alteration. Very, very good.
People say, do I have a favourite church? I don't, because they're all interesting. Even the humblest churches, and Holystone here is fairly humble, are absolutely fascinating. They've all got stories to tell. They're all valid.
Oh, favourites. I wonder if I've got a favourite. I think it's been mentioned, actually. I think I would have Old Buick, I think, as among my favourites. It's just because the whole site is so utterly magical, and the qualities of its interior are. And yet that was a completely ruined church in 1826, wasn't it? Just
completely ruined.
A brilliant rebuild. Yeah, fantastic places. So where do we go from here then?
I think we probably go to books.
Oh, right.
Well, here's how to buy this book if you haven't got it yet. I'm sorry, this last bit is the advert, so we'll try and get through it fairly fast. That's how to buy it anyway. If you email us at publications@broomley.org, and you'll get an invoice sent with it. Do you want to say anything, Elaine? No, she's muted.
Well, I think
just to say that this is the publisher price for it. There is a slightly higher recommended retail price, which you can get it from some local bookshops or online, but this is the publisher price. If you arrange to come and pick it up, you don't need to pay your postage and packing.
That'll explain why Andrew was so keen to come and pick it up. You see, he likes his £5. Yes, that's it.
Okay.
We've got a big box of it. Welcome. You get a free cup of tea with every copy you call for.
Right. And
if my sales manager would like to say more about these are other Broomley publications currently available.
When you get a copy of Reading the Fabric, you also get a listing of these books with the publisher's price for any of these. So should you be interested in any of these diverse things, if you've already got Reading the Fabric, but I didn't send you a list, just email me and I'll send you a list. with the various prices for these. And
coming soon, and they're actually all written and ready to print. Another 5. And there's also ones beyond this as well that we're not doing ourselves. There's a big book on towers and battles of Northumberland about to appear. So I've used the last year or so, or the COVID year and a half or whatever, in doing a lot of writing. I had a lot of stuff on my mental shelves I need to get down and write about. In some ways, I've moved on now into recording nonconformist chapels. And the Ebenezer project is really volume 1 of a 3-part suite, of which volume 2 is the chapels of Tyne and Weir. And volume 3, which is in preparation, that's what I've been doing today, is the chapels of Northumberland.
Tell them about the one you found last week. Peter, tell them about the one you found last week.
There's a remarkable chapel I hadn't known about at all at Bedlington. It's a United Methodist chapel from the 1850s, locally known as the Coffin Chapel. It's a brick building, quite Georgian in feel, and it's in the exact shape of a coffin. And I think it's intentional as a reminder of mortality. So it's got the 3-sided top, parallel sides, and a tapering bottom. And there is a parallel at Freshling Field in Surrey, I think it is. About 10 years earlier, the Baptists had built deliberately a coffin-shaped church to remind the worshippers they were going to die. Oh yes, and here's a picture of it being shown by Andrew. That's the Bedlington Chapel.
Goodness gracious.
The Coffin Chapel.
Right.
Really quite, and again, I missed that when I was listing. I don't know how, I don't know why, but it certainly deserves listing. It's now, it's still being used for worship by a modern fellowship, but it's externally it's quite unaltered, and it's remarkable. So you can still stumble on exciting things, even though they're nothing like as old as these medieval churches.
So are we going to move on to the questions now then, Elaine?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, we don't have questions from other people yet. Maybe they're still streaming them up, but I'm wondering if people wanted to have a day out and see 3 or 4 churches in any one area. What area would you recommend? Could you give us maybe 2 or 3 little days out where people could just do a little group of churches not far apart from one another?
I would go from Hexham up the North Tyne. I'd go from Hexham first of all, or maybe last of all. Then I would go to Gunnerton, which I think is the most extraordinary place with an extraordinary history, but designed by an extraordinary man. Wonderful, the only church in Northumberland which has got what you would call a full-on radical arts and crafts style to it. So I'd go from there. I'd go to Simonburn. I imagine I would go to one of those churches, those bizarre churches built by Greenwich Hospital, maybe Greysteds or one of those Thornyburn. End up at Bellingham, possibly, and I think you'll have seen some grandeur, some Victorian splendor or fascination, something utterly bizarre like that would be one of my trips. What about you, Peter?
Peter, would you stay more medieval then?
Well, yeah, I'm certainly Jonathan, which isn't in the book because it's Victorian, is lovely, absolutely lovely. I think the churches around here where we live, the defensible ones, Elsdon, Corsonside and Bellingham, which one of my books about to come out is about, they're a good group of defensible churches. You could maybe go with the Roxbury as well. There are several areas. There are several different patches. Churches around the coast, Newbiggin and Woodhorn.
So I have a question.
It's both a choice.
Yeah. I have a question now saying, what can you tell us about Chillingham Church and the amazing tomb?
Hi, John.
Well, the tomb. I find Chillingham an amazing church, first of all. Shall I start with that one?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, Peter. I love Chillingham. Chillingham Church. We're doing badly here. I'm going to say something about Chillingham, which I think is fascinating. It's got so much. It's got 12th century stuff, possibly even Anglo-Saxon stones on the north wall. It's got considerable amount of 13th century bits and pieces. It's got a 16th century window in the nave. It was partly rebuilt by the same man that he sneaked up from rebuilding Windsor Castle for William III and came up here. Wyatville came up here and remodeled the church in the 1820s. It's bizarre shaped, like several in Northumberland. Alwynton's another one where you climb step after step to get to the east end. And then, of course, in Chillingham, you get that one thing that you just don't find in Northumberland churches. You get up into the crossingy bit, and suddenly you're hit on the head by an absolutely massive carved masterpiece. And I mean, on the whole, the aristocracy of Northumberland got themselves buried somewhere else. But the Grey Tomb is remarkable for its quality, but also for its survival. Protected presumably because it's underneath the walls of a castle, but it's absolutely magnificent. And I mean, you can look at it for so many reasons. If you look at it from at her Elizabeth, I think she's called Elizabeth. She might not be called Elizabeth. They're usually Matilda or Elizabeth, but I think she might be called Elizabeth. But she's got fantastic clothes on. I mean, you could write theses about fashion in the 15th century from her, the jewelry that she's wearing, the wimple, the stitching on her headpiece. Oh, it's just an absolutely extraordinary thing. And then finally, I'm sorry to have gone on about this rather a long time, but the one time I was there, it was being visited by the York Georgian Society, and they were apoplectic with rage because they hated the plate glass window at the East End so much. They were shocked to pieces. And I didn't have the heart to tell them. I thought it was lovely because you could look at the trees during the sermon. And I thought it was very beautiful. So that's one of my favorite churches, that one.
Right. Now, a couple of people have picked up on the idea of defensibility. One person asking, have you ever looked at the earthworks around churches? And the second one about the relationship between Edlingham Church and the castle. The relative, what period is the castle and how does the defensibility relate? So if you'd like to pick up on that, on defensibility, that would be great.
Well, earthworks. I haven't looked enough at churches in the landscape. I must admit, I've concentrated on the buildings themselves, but certainly the shape of the churchyard and churchyard boundaries. I can think of a couple where there are earthworks. Berkeley in Northumberland, there is a church, but there's very much a bank surrounding, within the present churchyard. And Coulson side has a remarkable scarp running through the churchyard that must have been artificially added, which I think has been a defensible measure as well. But I mean, as ever, there's more work to do.
And
that wouldn't surprise you. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, can we go on to Edlingham?
Yeah. Well, the castle is later than the church, of course. The castle starts in the 13th century. It's not a Norman castle. It's really a fortified manor house, and it starts in the 13th. And then that lovely tower is basically a solar tower, a grand solar tower built on late in the 14th, I think. So the church is, several centuries older.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there's any direct relationship between them.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that gets me about Edlingham Tower is its quality, isn't it? It's you can look into the solar itself, or the Great Hall itself, perhaps, and see the outline of a great high vault and a really high quality posh fireplace as well. It must have been a place of some grandeur.
Mm-hmm.
And they copied that fireplace, in Alnham Church. It has a joggled lintel.
Ooh.
You don't know about joggled lintels, you won't go and look. It's made from the seeds of stone which are all cut to curves that fit with each other. And they've copied it. I think the architect F.R. Wilson was responsible. And the fireplace in the nave at Almond Church, a small-scale copy of the solar fireplace at Edward Newcastle.
There you are.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that as people begin to read the book, they will have other interesting things they want to follow up. I have been asked here, does Peter ever offer a guided day out? Maybe this is a new income stream for you, Peter.
Well, I'm open to offers.
Okay, so I think we'll close the formal part there, and thank everybody for listening.